Welcome back. It's 5/27 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Professor Lacocque's second lesson on Ezekiel 37 and the Valley of Dry Bones. He begins with a word of promise. There are three modalities of promise that Ezekiel mentions, and the first is this absolute fall. As we mentioned in the previous lesson, there's no way that we can have a rebirth of a new Israel until Israel faces the fact that the old Israel must die and be buried so that a new Israel can be raised up and reborn. But the rebirth is going to take place in their own land at Mount Zion. So Mount Zion ends up becoming tensioned against this valley. The valley of failure and death is tensioned against the Mount Zion of restoration and life in the New Jerusalem to come. The link between these two, between the old Israel that dies and the new Israel that will be reborn, is the linguistic bridge of Ezekiel's words. And his words are to bring forth and to speak to the new covenant of the Babylonian Israel that will reach the New Jerusalem. There are 8 aspects that he emphasizes. It will be Israel. It will be Israel who becomes the covenant people. That still will be the designation. They are the elect since the very beginning. But the new covenant will be centered around the question of justice, and that is justifying God's name, because God's name as the covenant Yahweh God has suffered under this fall and death of Israel in the dry valley. So it's the name of Yahweh that must be justified and may be made right. Now the new covenant is going to be all about universality. It's going to be about a covenant with all of creation. In this new covenant, Israel is supposed to be true image bearers that go out of themselves and reach out toward all of creation. So Ezekiel points to a new covenant that is truly universal in its nature, in its character. And the wind that comes to infuse and baptize the dry bones as the pneuma spirit, it comes from the 4 corners, which is a signification of pointing to the fact that it is the entire creation that is involved in this new covenant. The pneuma Spirit already pervades all of creation. It comes from the absolute furthest 4 corners. All of creation is permeated with the pneuma spirit of the divine. But Ezekiel's prophecy and Ezekiel's oracles are technically pre-eschatological, because eschatology is linked with the land for Ezekiel in his proclamation. And so what he says is pre-eschatological because eschatology will not begin until the new Israel reaches their own land and the New Jerusalem. That's when the new eschatology and the new covenant will begin as an eschatology. So the second moment is all about this true eschatology that will become an encounter in the Holy Land. Basically, there are 7 aspects of a salvation that is enchained with Holy Land. It is a covenant that is based on encounter with the doxa glory of Yahweh that will be present in the New Jerusalem and will save Israel from extinction. The old Israel will die, a new Israel will be raised up, but the old Israel is not extinct, but the old teleology toward the sarks and the negativity will die away, and a new Israel will be raised up in a new covenant. And so it is a salvation from extinction. The new land, the new Jerusalem will become the condition for creation, and land is a signification for life and moisture, whereas the dry bones were dryness and spiritual death. And the dry bones in themselves could not even be a seedbed for spiritual growth. Not the fallen Egyptian Israel. Transcendence is needed to create new life. Only transcendence of the pneuma spirit can create this new life. Now Jerusalem was a signification of the navel of the earth. In other words, Jerusalem at that time was considered the midst, the middle, the absolute center point of all creation, of all nations. And of course, in a signifying way, it was the spiritual center of the world. Notice the enchaining with land kind of gets emphasized by Ezekiel in 37:25 and following. The new covenant involves a resettling in Jerusalem. It will be a covenant of peace that will be inaugurated in that place, not before, but only after their arrival in the New Jerusalem. And here's the key, God's doxa glory will dwell there, but in a new way. So it's going to be the dwelling with the people in the New Jerusalem, but not a dwelling with of a doxa glory that's contained as an engraving on stone tablets that are enclosed in an ark. It's going to be a new kind of dwelling, but the promise from Ezekiel is that the doxa glory will dwell with the believers in the New Jerusalem. But the concept of holiness is encounter-based and concerns the land. The Holy Land is always promised, and divine encounter makes land holy. Lacocque mentions Moses on Sinai, and he says that the land only became holy as soon as Yahweh spoke and made it an encounter and made it a word event. Then the land was holy. So Holy Land is tension between the promise that is given and the encounter that is anticipated and experienced as word event and doxa glory presence. So in this lesson, Lacocque is very much trying to tell us that even the Ezekiel prophecy was not eschatology in itself. It was a prefigurement of eschatology. It pointed to the land moment when the true eschatology and the true new covenant will begin, and it all is centered around that concept of doxa glory. But the dwelling of the doxa glory with the people of Israel is going to be a new type of dwelling. Remember, this is Ezekiel who ate the scroll. The Word is going to live inside the believer from here on. The new covenant will be an indwelling of the theonomy. The theonomy will be indwelt. It will not be engraved on stone and stored in an ark. The indwelling will be the true new covenant, an indwelling of God's Word within the believer. So doxa glory will dwell with Israel in the New Jerusalem in a new way, not the old way of engraved stone tablets that are stored in an ark. So the actualization of event is a true eschaton. The eschatology begins in Jerusalem. The linguistic bridge of Ezekiel is coupled with the enchaining of the Holy Land to salvation, and that's where the word event of actualization takes place. Mount Zion, of course, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, is only holy because word event happens there. It's not holy because of the building that's built there. It's not holy for any other reason than the fact that the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is where word event happens. So the coming Jerusalem isn't just restoration. It's something new, something fundamentally new that will unfold there. The covenant is alive within the self rather than engraved and held in an ark. And the land becomes a true eschatology, a true actualization of new covenant. It becomes holy. Jerusalem becomes holy because God speaks there, because Yahweh makes himself present there as an indwelling pneuma spirit and doxa glory presence with the believing Israel nation. Now, the exalting of God's name and the justifying of God's name is the whole point of this new creation for Ezekiel, because the new covenant is theocentric, not anthropocentric. We are enjoined in, according to Ezekiel, the new covenant says we are enjoined in God's future. This is Yahweh's future. This is not an anthropocentric type of a doctrine of salvation. This is a theocentric justification of the divine name and the divine future and the divine covenant. We participate in the divine eschatology, the future of Yahweh. So the entire event of the eschatological actualization in the New Jerusalem is all about the forward-moving eschatology of God's Spirit, the forward-moving actualization of the covenant in a new type of way, in an indwelling that creates image bearers who can go into the world and be universally present to all nations and to all peoples. So it's an indwelling of a pneuma spirit which will become the new presence of the doxa glory of the divine. And that is going to necessarily imply, although it's not articulated here by Ezekiel, but by implication it will imply the fact that the priesthood is going to become obsolete eventually if the indwelling logos becomes the pneuma spirit that indwells every believer in the Jewish faith as a true presence of the doxa glory of God, of Yahweh. Then there's not going to be a priest that enters the Holy of Holies where stone tablets are stored, because the covenant will be stored in the hearts of the believers. So by implication, although it's not articulated formally, by implication the new covenant heads toward a eventually elimination of the priesthood, the high priest and the priesthood helpers of the built by hand of rock and mortar temple. So one thing we have to understand is that the whole idea that the first Spirit baptism occurred at Pentecost, we like to believe that as Christians, but there was a shift in covenant with Ezekiel. Before we get to this New Testament faith, there was a shift in covenant with Ezekiel. There was a shift in covenant with the deliverance out of Babylonian captivity and the emerging New Jerusalem that evolved. The problem is that the people of Israel did not fully internalize and comprehend Ezekiel's message and Ezekiel's imperative to become image bearers to the entire creation. That's the failure, that's the blindness that Jesus of Nazareth wanted to correct when he entered Jerusalem. It was blindness that had to be corrected. The new covenant had already been opened up. The new covenant was opened up with Ezekiel. The new covenant, that there would be Spirit baptism, Spirit indwelling, doxa glory presence with every believer, and that every believer includes a going out of necessity to the furthest ends of creation. That shift took place with Ezekiel, but unfortunately, what had to be corrected with Jesus of Nazareth was spiritual blindness. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were blind to the fact that that shift meant something dramatically and drastically different that they had not put into practice, that they had not engraved in their hearts. They had not tupos imprinted their hearts with this new covenant essential idea and truth. They hadn't quite understood it. So the shift in covenant came with Ezekiel. The baptism of Spirit came with Ezekiel. The imprinting of the heart of every believer in Israel with the doxa glory of God's presence came with Ezekiel. The downplay and eventually elimination of the Sadducee priesthood came with Ezekiel. All of this, we need to understand, came with the reclaiming of the New Jerusalem land after returning from exile from Babylon, and that Jesus of Nazareth came to give sight to the blind and blindness to the arrogant ones. So it's all about a correction of vision, a correction of understanding. And that's the emphasis that Lacocque is pointing out. Remember, this is all about recognition. The new covenant is about recognition. You know, Ezekiel's taken to the valley of dry bones and told, recognize these dry bones, recognize that Israel is dead and buried and needs to be raised up to new birth. Recognize this death. And Ezekiel proclaims this message so that Israel, so that the remnant can be born and raised up. But the remnant must first face the death of the Egyptian Israel. And the remnant of the Babylonian Israel will be raised up and reborn after they are delivered to the New Jerusalem, to their land, and put on their own land, where eschatology can begin based on this pre-eschatology, this prefigurement of eschatology given by Ezekiel. So that'll take us up through page 161, and we'll pick it up from there.